Good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you all to the 11th edition of the International Meeting on the Origins of Contemporary Philosophy at the Pontifical Catholic University of São Paulo. Due to the pandemic, this conference will be held for the first time online. This fact forced us to resort to a more appropriate approach that comprehend a smaller number of lectures and debates. Today's opening lecture will be delivered by an esteemed professor who participated in previous conferences, Professor Peter Simons. He is well known for his work on metaphysics and on the history of analytical philosophy in Central Europe. Professor Simons' titles and achievements are fruitful and vast to be listed here. So I will sum up by highlighting that he is currently one of the most influential philosophers of the world. Professor Simons' lecture will be followed by Marco Ruffino's debate, professor from the University of Campinas. I'm very grateful to you, Professor Simons and Professor Ruffino, for your participation in this meeting. I'm also very grateful to the President of the São Paulo City Council, Eduardo Tuma, and to the President of the School of the Parliament, Alexandro Santos, for their support that made it possible to hold the conference on its current format. Without further ado, now I invite Professor Simons to speak. Professor Simons.
Thank you, Mario. Thank you, Professor Porta. Before I start, let me just give a small warning. Sometimes my internet goes down, and if that happens, I will switch to using my mobile phone as a channel of communication. That happened to me when I was teaching last week, and it worked all right. So I'm hoping it won't happen again, but if it does, don't panic. I will get back to you within 5 minutes. The other thing that can happen is that my computer can go down, my desktop computer, but I have my laptop computer ready to go and connect with you if need be. So again, don't panic. I think it would only be an earthquake or a new war which would stop me from teaching. So let me share my screen so we can get started. Can someone tell me if they can see what's on the screen?
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
Good, 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 good. All right. So that's my title. And I always like to do a motto. So I actually have two mottos. The first one is by Quine. It's a famous quote of his, which I used to agree with, but now I don't agree with it. So this is logic as an old subject, and since 1879, it has been a great one. 1879 was the year of the publication of Frege's first great masterpiece, Begriffsschrift. I now would personally say logic is an old subject, and since 1837, it has been a great one. So that motto is due to me, and I made it up this morning. The point about it is that, well, we'll see what the point is when I get talking. So the contents of the talk, it's very simple, organized. There's not much complication. I'm going to start by talking about Dummett and origins of analytic philosophy. I'm going to talk about what happened before Frege with regard to analytic philosophy and logic, Frege's project, Frege's reception, and that will be the first part of Frege's reception. And then there is a second part, which is called the blossoming of Frege's reception. Then I'll talk about Frege and analytic philosophy. So everything is leading up to section 6, really. And then I'll draw a few conclusions. So in 1987, the foremost commentator on Frege, Professor Sir Michael Dummett, gave a series of lectures at the University of Bologna with the title Origins of Analytic Philosophy. After a series of translations of these appeared in German, Italian, and French, finally an authorized and revised English version appeared under that title in 1993. So that is my rather dog-eared copy, which shows I've read it quite a lot. I'm also rather proud that it has an inscription from the author behind the title page. Dummett deliberately refrained from using the definite article. He didn't call it the origins of analytical philosophy because he didn't want to be claimed, he didn't claim he was giving a genuine historical inquiry, or at least one not of the usual sort. I actually think it's not very historical at all. He described it as, quote, a history of thought rather than of thinkers, which I'm not quite sure about either. The main thrust of Dummett's Origins is to attempt to explain how it was that the chief figures of early analytic philosophy, namely Frege, and early continental philosophy, namely Husserl, could be doctrinally so close to one another in 1900, and yet stand at the beginnings of traditions which diverged to the point of mutual incomprehension and hostility. That is indeed a fascinating and puzzling fact, since Dummett is correct about both the early proximity and the later divergence and hostility, much of which is still with us. You just have to stand up in the middle of a seminar on analytic philosophy and say the word Derrida to see what happens. So, and especially since Dummett admits his book does not purport to a history, even of all of analytic philosophy, a more modest and accurate, if less snappy title for the book might have been some of the philosophical origins of the division between analytical and continental philosophy and their implications for what a correct theory of meaning should be like. So that would be a very honest title, but it would be rather 18th century in length. Dummett locates the origins of analytic philosophy squarely with Frege, and considers the chief doctrinal and methodological aspect of the Fregean revolution to be what he calls somewhat bizarrely the extrusion of thoughts from the mind. This is not to be taken literally. Thoughts as something mental cannot be extruded anywhere. Rather, what Dummett is highlighting is that the thoughts cannot, in his opinion, phenomenologists might disagree, be examined and assessed intersubjectively until they are expressed in language. The extrusion is the replacement of psychological or phenomenological treatments of thought and knowledge by an examination of the language in which such thought is expressed. The meanings of the expressions thus employed can be construed as the contents of the thoughts in question. The philosophy of language, and in particular the theory of meaning, takes methodological priority over other areas of philosophy, especially metaphysics and epistemology. Dummett locates the key episode of this revolution in a single sentence in Frege's Die Grundlagen der Arithmetik, quote, in English translation, never to ask for the meaning of a word in isolation, but only in the context of a proposition, unquote. This context principle, important though it is for Frege and in general, cannot bear the weight of being the key moment in a revolution in philosophy. Its presence in Grundlagen and its notable absence from the later Grundgesetze der Arithmetik have a much more prosaic and deflationary explanation. Grundlagen, unlike the other two books, Grundgesetze and Begriffsschrift, is in German prose throughout. Frege outlines there his plan for defining the concept of natural number or Anzahl. The way in which he does this is spelt out in section 72. And here is a quote. The expression n is a number is to mean the same as there exists a concept such that n is the number which belongs to it. Thus, says Frege, the concept of number receives its definition, apparently indeed, in terms of itself, but actually without any fallacy, since the expression, the number which belongs to the concept, has already been defined. It is to guard against the ready assumption that number which belongs to must get its meaning from number, that Frege cautions that the meaning of the latter is not given in isolation, but its use in the definitions, which is a whole proposition, not a phrase, is prior to its use in the definiendum, another proposition. In the Grundgesetze, where number is defined, everything happens in symbols, in the order that Frege requires, and the appearance of circularity does not arise. So now on to section 2, before Frege. To make Frege the sole star turn in the inception of analytic philosophy is to oversimplify the history. Frege was not the first to extrude thoughts from the mind, and nor was he the sole or even the prime conduit of analytical methods and attitudes making their way into philosophy. So let's look at just a little of the prehistory. Philosophy of language was, of course, an important part of the subject from antiquity, with Aristotle and the Stoics through the Middle Ages and into modern philosophy with Hobbes and Locke, and later with John Stuart Mill. But one person, like Frege, at once a mathematician, a logician, and a philosopher, looms largest as a direct ancestor of Frege in content, though not in influence, and that is Bolzano. Bolzano was born 5 months after the publication of Kant's first critique, and he died 40 days after Frege was born. So he spans the gap between Kant and Frege. Like Frege, he believed mathematics needed a more secure foundation. Like Frege, he put forward a radical new kind of logic in order to provide the principles for it. Like Frege, he deplored the intrusion of psychology into logic. And like Frege, he postulated the existence of a Platonic realm of abstract entities, propositions, and ideas in themselves, which were to be the contents of thought and the meanings of linguistic expressions. Despite his political persecution by the Austrian state and church, which severely curtailed his influence, Bolzano was modestly known among philosophers, especially in Austria. Husserl took note of both Frege and Bolzano. His anti-psychologism drew from both, but his theory of logic was closer to that of Bolzano. Frege probably never read Bolzano, though both Benno Kerry and Alvin Korzelt drew his attention to their similarities, but Frege did not respond. Bolzano's careful way of arguing for his views across a wide range of subject matters, much broader than that of Frege, has much in common with later analytic philosophy, and it is he, more than Frege, who has the strongest claim to be the first modern analytic philosopher. And somewhere Dummett, I think, calls him the grandfather of analytic philosophy. His widespread neglect in English language philosophy can be ascribed both to the extent of his work. His main works were always more than one volume. Both Wissenschaftslehre and his philosophy of religion are 4 volumes, very thick. But not just the extent of his work, the fact that until recently, little of it was available in English translation. Now there is a wonderful translation in 4 volumes of the Wissenschaftslehre, the theory of science. Bolzano was known to Russell through his posthumously published Paradoxes of the Infinite, which influenced Cantor in the invention of set theory. But apart from Husserl and Kerry, he was hardly present in the German-speaking world until Heinrich Scholz took notice of him in the 1930s. It was in Poland that his influence was chiefly felt. Twardowski and Łukasiewicz both studied and quoted him. Modern studies of Bolzano by Eduard Winter, Anders Wedberg, but especially Jan Berg, Edgar Morsche and others brought the ambitious and scholarly Gesamtausgabe into being, currently over 100 volumes and still growing. Latter-day studies by Wolfgang Kühner and his Hamburg students have made Bolzano known to a modest circle in Germany, and translations by Rolf George, Paul Rusnock and Steve Russ have made Bolzano's logical and mathematical work accessible to English speakers, most of whom don't speak or understand German these days. While more needs to be done to accord Bolzano his rightful place in modern philosophy, there is no longer any excuse for his neglect. Section 3 is Frege's project. Frege was a full-time mathematician in a way that Bolzano, for example, was not. Bolzano had a chair of religion, not of mathematics. Frege's major works are about the foundations of mathematics and the logic he developed to establish his logicism. The motivation for this was indeed of a philosophical nature. It was to establish that arithmetic and analysis are analytic, not synthetic in nature, not synthetic a priori as Kant had claimed. Lost the page here, so I apologise. What happened to page 4? Okay, I'm going to have to go and look at my page 4 in my document. What happened there? Okay, let's look at page 4. By showing this, namely that arithmetic follows from logic clearly, and deriving the basic laws of arithmetic and analysis from logical principles and definitions, Frege was striving, as Bolzano, Cauchy and Weierstrass before him had striven, though with less acute means, to place these mathematical sciences on an unshakable logical foundation. That the project founded on the rocks of Russell's contradiction was, to say the least, unfortunate for Frege, but in the process he was, with Peirce and to a lesser extent Peano, one of the founding fathers of contemporary mathematical logic. Nothing, not even the contradiction, can take this away from him. Bolzano's logic was semantically based, but had archaic features and lacked the formal axiomatic system that Frege practically perfected. It too, that is Bolzano's system, was almost certainly subject to paradoxes, but for want of a formal system, this cannot be conclusively demonstrated. So Bolzano scholars differ as to whether you can derive contradictions from the assumptions in Bolzano. On the other hand, Frege's writings in the philosophy of language and logic are modest in extent, not 4 volumes worth. The 1892 essay Über Sinn und Bedeutung, on which Frege's reputation as a philosopher of language largely depends, and which has been required reading for students of analytic philosophy for 3 generations, has a stated aim and an unstated motivation. The stated aim is to get clear about the status of identity sentences, which are true, but not self-evidently true. With minor caveats, the distinction between sense and denotation, as I shall call Bedeutung, resolves this problem. A sentence like 12 squared equals 10 squared plus 4 times 11 is not only true, but necessarily true. But the expressions on either side of the identity sign present the object they denote in 2 different ways, by 2 different computational routes, and so differ in sense. Frege then employs the distinction to deal with a number of interesting linguistic phenomena like direct and indirect quotation. So it's basically there to explain the nature of identity sentences. It has 1 or 2 applications in the philosophy of language, which Frege elaborates very brilliantly, it must be said. But The unstated motivation for the essay and its publication in 1892 is to clear the ground for Grundgesetze, volume 1 of which appeared the following year, where the sense denotation distinction is hardly mentioned, and it plays no role at all in the logical system, which is extensional through and through. Of Frege's other philosophical essays, On Concept and Object is his, in my view, unsuccessful attempt to stave off criticism by Benno Kerry of the strict parallelism between saturated and unsaturated expressions on the one hand, and saturated and unsaturated entities on the other, objects and functions, basically. The three late essays comprising the logical investigations, logische Untersuchungen, are an exercise in semantic Platonism, where Frege wittingly or otherwise approaches Bolzano's views, written after logicism had been abandoned, and indeed very clear and well written. The pièce de résistance of Frege's philosophical writings is undoubtedly Die Grundlagen der Arithmetik, which is intellectually incisive and stylistically elegant throughout. Dummett rightly praises it as the single most important work in the philosophy of mathematics. Even here, however, Frege's aim is limited. To prepare the way for his logicist treatment of arithmetic, firstly by criticizing other theories of number, and secondly by outlining informally how he was going to define number and derive the basic principles of arithmetic. Both of these aims are largely achieved. Frege's demolition of previous theories is very largely successful, and his sketch for the future development is also mainly clear, though the status of the infamous extensions of concepts is left hanging. So let's go back to the slideshow. Here we are, back with Bolzano. So Frege's reception. Frege's work was received, especially early on, sparsely and with little understanding. The Griffschrift, here is a couple of pages from it, occasioned puzzled incomprehension, mainly because of its arcane notation. Nothing like that had been seen before, and most people can't read it even today. And that particular section is really quite elaborate and complex because it uses a very interesting kind of variable binding. That's another story. Frege was advised, I think by Peano, to go and study Boole, who had been doing symbolic logic for a generation or more, which he did. And Frege rightly found his own work superior to Boole's, but he failed to get his critical comparison into print. The journal editors didn't want to know. Even Grundlagen was not well received. Husserl and Kerry took notice and ventured into print criticizing aspects of Frege's work. In both cases, I think partly correctly. But against these, Frege reacted sharply, especially in the case of Husserl. There was the famous review of Husserl's Philosophie der Arithmetik from 1891. Other potential allies of Frege in the fight against obscurity, such as Peano, Dedekind, and Hilbert, did not become partners in his crusade. In their correspondence about the foundations of geometry, Hilbert and Frege, who crossed swords on the nature of geometry, Hilbert emerges as the clear victor over Frege's old-fashioned Kantian Euclidean view. And it is the Hilbertian conception of axiomatics, not the Fregean, that informs modern mathematics. Husserl corresponded with Frege, and despite their differences, their views are convergent in important aspects. By the end of his life, however, Husserl, by then probably the foremost living German philosopher, was astonishingly ungenerous about Frege, writing to Heinrich Schultz in 1936 that, quote, "I never got to know G. Frege personally, and I no longer remember the occasion for our correspondence. He was generally regarded at the time as an outsider, Sonderling," actually nowadays you'd probably say weirdo, "who was astute but unfruitful, either as a mathematician or as a philosopher." That's a really astonishing assessment. Husserl is careful not to say that he judged Frege in this negative or nugatory way, but neither does he distance himself from the general opinion. The person who did most to bring Frege's work to wider attention, especially outside the mathematical community, was Bertrand Russell, who published a sagacious 22-page appendix, The Logical and Arithmetical Doctrines of Frege, in The Principles of Mathematics of 1903. The double irony was that it was Russell who drew Frege's attention to the inconsistency of his logic, and it was also Russell who 2 years later in 1905 criticized the sense denotation distinction in his essay on denoting. But Russell was more generous with praise and less vituperatively reactive to criticism than Frege. And it's notable that in the preface to volume 1 of Principia Mathematica of 1910, Whitehead and Russell write, quote, "In all questions of logical analysis, our chief debt is to Frege." Russell invited Frege to speak at the 5th International Congress of Mathematicians, held in Cambridge from 22nd to 28th of August, 1912. I didn't know this until I researched this paper, in fact. But Frege declined without giving any clear reason. Quote, this is the English translation of his letter. "I see that there are weighty reasons for my going to Cambridge, and yet I feel that there is something like an insuperable obstacle." I don't know the German original because I don't have it, but I'm sure it's similar. So was Frege shy or fatigued or embarrassed that he might be regarded as the mathematician whose project had failed? We don't know. At the Congress, Russell, who was chairman of the section on philosophy and history, said in his opening remarks, quote, "I had hoped, but in vain, that we might have been honoured by the presence of Frege, who after many years of indomitable perseverance is now beginning to receive the recognition which is his due," unquote. That recognition was due in good part, it must be noted, to Russell himself. Frege's influence on Russell was not, in my opinion, wholly positive. Russell's logicism, which he started developing independently of Frege, was conceptually richer than Frege's and its scope much broader. It was supposed to cover the whole of pure mathematics. Frege did not think that geometry was analytic. It was broader but less exact. Among the elements which Russell revised in response to Frege's work was to drop his own concept of a class as many, which in my view was a mistake, as it is classes as many of which cardinal numbers other than one are truly predicated. Russell's idea of a propositional function owes much to Frege, but he does distinguish between propositional and descriptive functions, whereas in Frege, concepts and relations are ordinary functions. It's just that their values are truth values, true or false, the true or the false. In Principia, propositional functions replace classes altogether, but as Quine later pointed out, the concept of a propositional function was not unequivocal in Russell and Whitehead. We do know, of course, that Russell's one-time student Wittgenstein had visited Frege, who had apparently advised him to study with Russell. Wittgenstein, whether from his own reading or with the encouragement of Russell, probably both, thought so highly of Frege that in the preface to the Tractatus, he mentions only 2 influences, but he praised, quote, "the great works of Frege," unquote, more highly than, quote, "the works of my friend, Mr. Bertrand Russell," unquote. Yet Wittgenstein's efforts in the philosophy of logic from 1912 onwards are at least as critical of Frege as they are of Russell. He was especially critical of Frege's treatment of clauses as names of truth values, to which he opposed his own theory of the true-false bipolarity of propositions, which I think was a good change. Frege and Wittgenstein corresponded with, for Frege, unaccustomed warmth during the First World War. Frege admired the way that Wittgenstein could work on his ideas while being a soldier in the front lines. At the end of the war, Wittgenstein made a substantial gift of money to Frege. It must have been all the harder for Frege to contain his disappointment upon receiving and reading one of only 3 typescripts of the Tractatus sent to him by Keynes. He found Wittgenstein's epigrammatic style and the lack of justification for his statements completely alien, and even advised Wittgenstein, if he wanted to get the work published, to break it up into article-sized pieces. Wittgenstein did not take well to that suggestion. The utter contrast between their styles and approaches to issues in the philosophy of logic made each of them frustrated with the other. Even the first sentence of the Tractatus, Die Welt ist alles, was der Fall ist, had Frege puzzled. Quote, "As for your own writing, I already depart from it at the very first sentence. Not that I took it to be false, but the sense is unclear to me," unquote. Wittgenstein writes to Russell he's very fed up with having to give what he says are purely and simply explanations to Frege, who doesn't understand a word of my manuscript. Now, while Wittgenstein certainly did have some important criticisms of Frege and some important insights of his own, I am completely at one with Frege in his dismay at Wittgenstein's intense reluctance to argue for his views, but rather to, to pronounce them like an Old Testament prophet or an oracle. A Cambridge mathematical contemporary and acquaintance of Frege's was Philippe Jourdain. He was one of the few outside Germany to have read Frege at this time, and indeed he translated parts of Grundgesetze and summarized Frege's system in a chapter of his The Development of the Theories of Mathematical Logic and the Principles of Mathematics, published in 1912. This chapter is incidentally republished as an appendix to the English translation of Frege's correspondence. Jourdain had been in correspondence with Frege and received helpful feedback about his summary, which is on the whole accurate, probably the first really accurate summary apart from Russell's. Jourdain, who also knew Russell, died in 1920 and his influence was very limited. One thing we do discover from Frege's correspondence with Jourdain is that Frege found reading Principia Mathematica very difficult, not just because his English was limited, but because of the imprecision of the author's metalogical explanations. The editor of the correspondence between Jourdain and Russell, Ivor Grattan Guinness, conjectures that had Russell first learnt his mathematical logic not from Frege, but rather from Peano, that much of the imprecision of Principia might have been avoided. I don't know whether that's true, but it's a thought. Frege was positively received among Polish logicians. So let's skip to some Polish logicians there. Jan Łukasiewicz, the eldest of the second generation of Polish analytical philosophers, mentioned Frege in connection with the notion of truth values, generalizing these in his theory of probability of 1913 and extending them in his many-valued logics. So there weren't just 2, there were 3 or 4 or infinitely many. Łukasiewicz simplified Frege's treatment of propositional calculus and perfected its axiomatics. The other logician, Stanisław Leśniewski, was perhaps the first logician to clearly and explicitly value Frege's work, the contradiction notwithstanding, above that of Whitehead and Russell, writing in 1927, quote, "In the history of the establishment of mathematics, the most amazing embodiment of the achievement made since Greek times on the question of the soundness of the deductive method is still for me the Grundgesetze der Arithmetik of Gottlob Frege." Leśniewski appreciated the precision with which Frege explained his system and carried out his deductions. The informal expositions of Whitehead and Russell, though not their deductions, left so much to be desired in terms of use-mention mistakes and equivocations that for some years Leśniewski was unable to understand them at all. Leśniewski's mature career from 1914 until his death in 1939 can be considered as an attempt to provide a paradox-free foundation for mathematics in a way which owed much to both Russell and Frege, but which went his own highly distinctive way. In Germany and Austria, philosophers such as Carnap, Reichenbach and Schlick began to appreciate Frege's work. Carnap had indeed studied with Frege in Jena before the First World War. Interestingly, and perhaps surprisingly, Schlick, in unpublished writings, rated Bolzano above Frege among logicians between Leibniz and Russell, I think because of the inconsistency. Heinrich Scholz, who was the first professor of mathematical logic in Germany, initially a Protestant theologian, interestingly, sponsored discussion of Frege's work in Münster from the early 1930s. And in 1935, he negotiated with Alfred Frege, the philosopher's adopted son, the transfer of Frege's Nachlass to Münster. He also made a public request for letters from Frege to be transferred to Münster, and many, including Russell, responded positively. Wittgenstein, it must be said, responded negatively, saying that the letters contained nothing of scientific value, but only matters of sentimental value to himself. Unfortunately for Wittgenstein, the letters turned up in an attic in Vienna in 1988. And in view of Frege's negative, or rather uncomprehending, reaction to the Tractatus, which are detailed in those letters, it must be said that this did not reveal much candor on Wittgenstein's part. He probably didn't want people to know that Frege was very negative about the way the Tractatus was presented. While Scholz did make progress in cataloguing and in some cases copying Frege's unpublished writings, what we owe basically to Scholz. He was adept at obtaining funding for these. The majority of the original material was destroyed when the university library, where they had been taken from Scholz's apartment to the library basement for safekeeping, was bombed in an Allied raid on the 25th of March 1943. And almost certainly destroyed, although there is just a very small chance that one or two things survived in the basement and the librarians haven't found them yet. I keep hoping, but I don't suppose with much optimism. Scholz continued to work on what could be rescued after the war, but he was unable to bring publication to completion. So next section is on the blossoming of Frege's reception. Almost all of the reception we've considered so far is of Frege's logic and to some extent the philosophical justification of it. Frege is a general philosopher whose example is to be held up to all, especially the young, is in such areas as the philosophy of language, as a paradigm analytic philosopher, is absent. Of course, there was indirect influence through the person of Russell, who was considerably more influential in general philosophy than Frege, propagandizing for the application of logical methods in all areas of philosophy, and also through the increasing adoption by philosophers of the tools of the predicate logic set in train by Frege. In America, recognition was slow in coming. Lewis Langford's influential 1932 summary, Symbolic Logic, mentions Frege briefly only twice in connection with Russell. The young Quine took not Frege, but Russell and Whitehead as his model, and Carnap as well, it must be said. The United States started to catch up in logic, mainly through the immigration of Europeans, such as Carnap, Reichenbach, and later Tarski. Carnap's Meaning and Necessity of 1942 applies the Fregean distinction between sense and denotation, they're called intension and extension, much more widely and systematically than others of the time. The beginning of Frege's reception as a general philosopher of genius, not just in logic, are to be found in England. John Austin gave a seminar on Grundlagen in Oxford in 1949, and for this purpose he produced a translation of the work into English, which is in general exemplary in its accuracy and style. The first edition of 1950 was corrected for the second edition of 1953, and Austin expressly thanks the young Peter Geach for corrections. Geach, together with former Wittgenstein student Max Black, published a useful collection, Translations from the Philosophical Writings of Gottlob Frege, in 1952, second edition 1960. This comprised bits of his books and several of his essays. In many ways, it is still the best primer for students being introduced to Frege. It contains the three essays of the 1890s, Function and Concept, Concept and Object, Sense and Reference, as well as strategically important bits of the two main treatises, but not Grundlagen, which was already in English translation. Most of the translations are by Geach, two are by Black, and the exceptions from Grundgesetze are from Jourdain. Like many others, I had my first introduction to Frege through these translations. Although superseded in scope and modern scholarship by Michael Beeny's bigger The Frege Reader of 1997, it stands the test of time well, and it's notable that Beeny dedicates his book to Geach and posthumously to Black. Geach was certainly one of the most assiduous and yet critically astute commentators on Frege. A new chapter in Frege's reception began in 1957 when the young Michael Dummett spent time in Münster. Dummett energetically sorted through Scholz's materials. Scholz had died the previous year and attempted unsuccessfully to get British money to finance publication. Money that only began to flow when Scholz's student Hans Hermes obtained German funding in 1961. And the first concrete steps to posthumous publications were initiated. By 1964, Dummett had written a comprehensive treatise on Frege, which was almost complete, but he put it on one side, both because he was revising his ideas as he went, and because he wanted to spend more time to fighting racism in Britain. He explains this very clearly in the preface to his first book. The book was eventually split into two parts. The monumental Frege Philosophy of Language appeared in 1973, Frege Philosophy of Mathematics not until 1991, which year also saw the publication of the essays Frege and Other Philosophers. Controversy surrounding Frege's interpretation of Frege occasioned an intermediate volume, The Interpretation of Frege's Philosophy, in 1981. In which Dummett replied to his critics. In total, Dummett devoted over 1,800 pages to the exposition and evaluation of Frege. There they are. Look at my copies are all rather worn because of the use I've made of them. This feat of writing nearly 2,000 pages of Frege, there are one or two other essays as well, will almost certainly never be matched again. Whatever the merits or otherwise of Dummett's interpretation of Frege, and I think there are problems with them, and of his criticisms, which have been accorded mixed reception almost everywhere, it cannot be denied that Dummett did most to establish Frege as the central figure in early analytic philosophy, for many, if not most, of its followers. It's Dummett who sees Frege as the modern equivalent of Descartes, irrevocably shifting the primary focus of philosophy from epistemology to the philosophy of language, just as Descartes had shifted it from metaphysics to epistemology. Alongside the exegetical and critical work of Dummett, there was the effort to get Frege's writings translated into English, following on from the lead of Geach and Black. as in our times regrettably few English-speaking philosophers know German, and it's also not suitable for undergraduate teaching outside the Germanophone area. Two translations of Begriffsschrift by Jan van Heijenoort and Terrell Ward-Bynum were followed by the correspondence translated by Hans Karl and the posthumous writings edited by Geach's Leeds colleagues Peter Long and Roger White. Together with Geach, they took the regrettable decision to translate Frege's word Bedeutung as meaning, which, while linguistically correct, is philosophically horrendously misleading. Max Black's translation as reference was dominant for some decades, but is not ideal. Alonzo Church's denotation is also not wholly unobjectionable. Lost my point. And it's the one I tend to use. So I tend to say denotation for Bedeutung, which is what Russell used as well. My own opinion is that the best possible translation is one that nobody uses, and I will mention it, but I will not force it on anyone, and that is the word signification, which has both the ambiguity of Frege's term and is also close to medieval terminology. In fact, it's the Italian version of that Frege recommended in correspondence to Peano. Sense and signification sounds good as well. Anyway, it's up to you. The work of translation is now more or less complete in English, with the complete translation of Grundgesetze by Philipp Ebert, Markus Rosberg, and Crispin Wright, which appeared in 2012. The principal problem with that was not so much translating German into English, although there was a committee which advised on that, but doing the symbols and the formulas, which required considerable innovation in tech typesetting to achieve. It's a tour de force. They, that is Ebert, Marcus and Crispin Wright, incidentally, revert, I think, fortunately, to translating Bedeutung as reference. And it may be that this time that translation will stick. It was Crispin Wright in his 1983 book, Frege's Conception of Numbers as Objects, who inaugurated a new wave of examining Frege's philosophy of mathematics. This gave rise both to the program of neo-Fregeanism, which strives to rescue as much as possible from the shipwreck of Frege's own system, but also inspired others such as George Boulos and Richard Heck to examine Grundgesetze itself in depth and note the fruitfulness and technical brilliance of that work, which most commentators simply left aside because of the contradiction that Frege had created in it. Frege would, I think, be much less downhearted about his achievements were he able to read the modern literature than he was at the end of his own life. There is now a large body of work, most of it, but not quite all, of excellent quality on Frege's work and its flaws and lessons for us. That it does not approach in scale, breadth, or variety of quality the enormous outpourings of the Wittgenstein commentary industry is wholly understandable, given the differences in systematicity, style, clarity, and directness of purpose of the two. Nevertheless, the importance of Frege as one of the main drivers of what was to become mainstream analytic philosophy is now irreversibly established. And I think Frege's reputation will stand the test of time better than that of Wittgenstein. So, section 6 is on Frege and analytic philosophy. It has frequently been noted that the term analytic philosophy is not only vague in itself, but as time has passed, it has become harder to encapsulate what it means, as the variety of philosophical works and approaches, which are, we might say, broadly analytic, has increased. In the beginning, almost all analytic philosophy consisted in a response to issues in the philosophical foundations of mathematics. This applies whether one takes Frege or Russell or Bolzano or anyone else to be the father or grandfather or godfather or chief author of analytic philosophy. If analytic philosophy entails adherence to the linguistic turn, as Dummett says, then many latter-day philosophers do not count as analytic, despite their style of work and their adherence to rational argumentation. I don't adhere to the linguistic turn, but I consider myself, for the most part, an analytic philosopher. Dummett himself cites Gareth Evans in this regard. One can also mention David Armstrong, Jonathan Lowe, John Heil, and now many more who revert to Aristotle in according metaphysics priority over philosophy of language and logic. If analytic philosophy entails use of logical tools and adherence to the use of predicate logic and formal semantics, then the later Wittgenstein is less of an analytic philosopher than, say, Husserl or Reinach. The foundations of mathematics have scant direct relevance to issues of epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, or philosophy of mind, although analytic philosophy has delivered notable advances in all these areas. So what is the role of Frege in analytic philosophy? And is he the central figure Dummett claims he is? Firstly, let's put us to rest once and for all the idea that Frege was, or at least was principally, a philosopher. He was a mathematician, a professor of mathematics, and he taught just mathematics and its foundations. He specialized in logic and, with admittedly epistemological motivations, embarked on his logicist enterprise, a failed enterprise. But he was not more of a philosopher per se than, say, his contemporary Hilbert. Though, to the extent that he engaged in philosophy, he was overall sounder and certainly clearer than Hilbert was. Try reading Hilbert. He is not as clear as Frege. A lot of his prose is distressingly vague in crucial places. Though, in my view, Hilbert's sophisticated formalism is closer to the truth about the nature of pure mathematics than is Frege's logicism. Also, Frege's excursions into the philosophy of language are astute, but they are relatively limited in scope, though their later implications developed by others are much broader. Frege's chief achievement for philosophy was to craft a system of logic that was of unsurpassed power and clarity, and which, with the assistance of hundreds of others and augmentation through semantic analyses of modality, tense, and other indexical elements, has become the principal tool of argumentative analysis in philosophy, which aims to be exact. It has even, and Frege might be turning in his grave to know this, infiltrated and informed that revival of psychologistic tendencies that go under the name of cognitive science. Analytic philosophy is not the achievement of any single person. Various figures, including not just those I've already mentioned, but also Peirce, Schroeder, James, Mach, Poincaré, Moore, Couturat, Stout, and others, had a greater or lesser role in shifting philosophy into the mode of working we call analytic. Of all those involved, if asked to name one person whose influence and example at the time was greater than any other single one in pushing philosophy in this direction, I would have to name Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Arthur William Russell, 3rd Earl Russell, Order of Merit, Fellow of the Royal Society. There he is. It was Russell whose work expanded beyond logic and philosophy of mathematics to encompass other areas of philosophy, philosophy of science, philosophy of mind, epistemology, and even to some extent ethics. It was Russell who insisted that the new logic would be the way to approach philosophical problems. Ironically, perhaps, very few of Russell's specific philosophical opinions have stood the test of time and detailed examination. Russell partly because Russell changed his mind so often, but also because I don't think very much of his views stand up to the test of time. But this would certainly not have surprised or even dismayed Russell, given that his own views were so notoriously prone to revision. Conclusions then. Is Frege the father of analytic philosophy? No. He was a mathematician with philosophical interests. He was an early driver of analytic philosophy, one of the main early drivers of analytic philosophy. Was he influential in the growth of what we know as analytic philosophy? Initially, not at all. But later, yes, though mainly indirectly through the advocacy of Russell and a few others. What are his chief legacies to analytic philosophy? There are three. A near-perfect formulation of a powerful, logical system, vastly surpassing traditional logic. Secondly, a strong impetus to use logical methods to analyze language. And finally, a fine example of the importance of precision and clarity in writing. Before Frege, not many German-speaking philosophers wrote clearly, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche being notorious examples to the contrary. But most German philosophers wrote what Łukasiewicz called German blah blah. So, does that encompass all of analytic philosophy? By no means. There are many streams and subdisciplines in analytical philosophy which owe little beyond general methodological attitude to Frege. Does that include all of what we might call modern scientific philosophy? No, because the work of Brentano, the Austrian tradition, the early phenomenologists, and the Polish school, Lwów-Warsaw School in particular, but also the Krakow school, is also in its different way scientific, although it does not undertake, most of it anyway, the linguistic turn. Later Poles perhaps did, but that was because they were interested in logic. Is Frege still worth studying and teaching and reading in the original texts? Answer, absolutely. It's wrong to criticize, is it wrong to criticize Frege or any of his views? One or two of my former Leeds colleagues always raised an eyebrow when I ventured to criticize anything that Frege said. Answer, certainly not. Frege is not infallible, and it is good to examine his ideas critically. But Frege is a giant on whose shoulders all analytic philosophers stand. By emulating his honesty, precision, and clarity, we should be able to see further and more clearly. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. If I understood, I'm supposed to conduct a sort of dialogue now. Let me start my presentation, but before doing that, I want to thank Mario for inviting me to have this conversation with you about Frege, which is one of my favorite philosophers. And by the way, I think every time I met you, Peter, was in a Frege conference somehow in Europe, or every time. So we are always talking about Frege.
So I want to else sometime, yes.
I want to thank Mario for inviting me, and I want to congratulate him and Bruno and Camila for conducting this event under these very difficult situations. So keeping up with the tradition of these encounters on the origins of contemporary philosophy. That's very nice that you're doing that this year under these circumstances, so there's no interruption in the tradition. I also want to say, like Peter, my internet sometimes is defective, but it doesn't go out. It doesn't. I mean, it will. There will be some short interruptions in my talk, but it will come back. It will get back, right? Let me. I have some slides here. Excuse me. Just a second. Okay, can you see my presentation? Can you see it? Okay.
Yes.
I basically agree with almost everything that Peter said. Is an incredibly nice paper, well written and historically accurate and well informed. Can you see it? No?
Anymore. Mario, can you see it?
Hello, Peter. The problem is with Marco.
Oh, okay. Can you see it now? Okay. All right. I basically agree with everything that Peter said. It is an interesting lecture on the history of philosophy, the history of logic, the history of philosophy of language, putting into perspective this idea that Frege is the father or the initiator of analytic philosophy. That's really untrue. But since this is a debate, I'm supposed to build some slight disagreement with Peter. It's only gonna be more of a matter of emphasis or style, and at the end we agree on the basics. So let me say that there are three leading questions in Peter's paper. The first is Frege the father of analytic philosophy? Father with capital F and the emphasis in the definite article. He presents a rich and historically accurate paper, and the journal response is, of course, no, Frege is not the father, right? And I agree, because very rarely someone is the father of something, of anything in philosophy. And even less in the case of analytic philosophy. I was very impressed by an interview given by Carnap. Perhaps Carnap is the one who mostly incarnates the spirit of Fregean philosophy. But I was very impressed by an interview given by Carnap in the 50s or 60s to the German television. He says, well, look, philosophy now is done in a new paradigm. Nobody does things alone. Wir können alle zusammenarbeiten. We all do things together. It's like building a cathedral. Each one does a little piece of it. There is a general outline, and each one of us does something. So it's a new way of conceiving of philosophy. I think that's the spirit of analytic philosophy, right? So there is no big father. So there's maybe an inspiration or something. So I completely agree with Peter on this one. The second question is, whether Frege is a fundamental influence on the paradigmatic analytic philosophers. And undoubtedly, the answer is yes. The early Russell, as Peter showed us, did a lot to call attention of the philosophical and mathematical world to Frege's work. The early Wittgenstein, Quine with a star, because Peter calls our attention that Quine's primary influence was Russell and Whitehead and Polish logicians, and not exactly Frege, but Quine mentions Frege quite a lot in his investigations on philosophy of language. Peter Strawson, of course, Davidson, Evans, the early Kaplan, and so on. And even the neo-Russellian team, right? These are people that are closer to my own philosophical training, like Kripke David Kaplan, Salmon, Perry, and so on, all have an enormous debt to Frege. All of them have an important part of their philosophy defined as pro or contra Frege. So all of them, they build, so to say, the neo-Russellianism. They are supposed to be the enemies, in quotation marks, of Frege, but they all pay an enormous respect to Frege in their writings, especially David Kaplan. David Kaplan's philosophy in demonstratives is all the time a dialogue with Frege, right? And we can also see that the Fregean vocabulary, his terminology, sense, reference, thought, truth value, and even the words of his examples, right? Hesperus and Phosphorus, Gustav Lauben, etc. This vocabulary remains deeply impregnated in the analytic philosophical imagination more than 100 years later, right? Perry uses all the time examples and words coming from Kaplan, even when he's arguing or presenting a position contrary to Frege's position. So whether Frege is a major influence in the big analytic philosophers, that's undoubtedly yes. But a second question is, how original was Frege's contribution, technically and in spirit? Here, again, I am in general agreement with Peter, and it is very good that he mentions other contemporary or not so contemporary, like Bolzano, for example. In spirit, Frege was not so original. He was the product of his neo-Kantian environment. Like, he was a student of Lotze. He uses a lot of ideas from Tedelenburg. Gottfried Gabriel has this nice article from 1986, Frege als Neu-Kantianer, in which he shows these many connections. Frege was not an entirely original philosopher, right? And there are other contemporary similar projects like Peano, Schröder, Bull, Dedekind, and so on. And it's very good that Peter mentions Bolzano and originality of Bolzano. Technically, perhaps technically, Frege was more original and more precise than his rivals, right? In the idea, the introduction of quantifiers, the introduction to an extensive use of the truth values, and a two-dimensional representation of formulas, which has its advantages. Although, as Peter said, few people nowadays are able to read Frege, but it has a lot of advantages. If you learn how to read it, then you see that how much clarity you gain for that. So that's the second question. And here's the third question: how some of Frege's ideas is impregnated or influential in the subsequent philosophical analytic tradition. Here, I'm not in disagreement with Peter, but I'm more enthusiastic of Frege's influence than he seems to be in his paper, right? And I'm gonna mention here 5 or 6 ongoing research programs that I think, even though if Frege's name doesn't come up very frequently, they have the Fregean bedrock, they have the Fregean DNA. So, which attests the huge influence of Frege in modern, contemporary analytic philosophy. Well, first, the obvious field is logic. Some of Frege's ideas in logic became so impregnated that they are part of any contemporary manual. They are the received view nowadays. For example, the idea that the semantic value of propositional variables are just truth values. Some people criticize Frege for taking the reference of sentences as being truth values. But this is exactly what every introduction to elementary propositional logic teaches our students to do, right? The basic value assignments to sentential letters, to propositional variables, is just a truth value, right? With no questioning. But that's basically the Fregean idea, right? And that's the idea that propositional connectives are truth functions, right? Functions that take truth values or ordered pairs of truth values and yield truth values. And as far as I know, this appears for the first time in Frege's Über Funktion und Begriff from 1891. but this is part of our received view nowadays. The formalization of sentences from ordinary language using quantifiers. That's what every logic student is supposed to do. That's part of the training nowadays. And they study, very important, I think, they study of logic with the construction of a formal artificial language as a starting point. That's what the Begriff shift does, right? This is all part of our normal, regular training in logic nowadays. So using the vocabulary of Thomas Kuhn in the structure of scientific revolution, we live in a period of normal science in logic, and our paradigm is basically the Fregean paradigm, as I see it. Well, here's a second example of an ongoing research program, right? Montague's program of outlining the semantics of ordinary language using the resources of formal logical language. That was the Fregean idea when he wrote the Begriff shift. But of course, Frege thought that this is only applicable to mathematical language and perhaps, right, in über das Tragheitgesetz, on the law of inertia, in a formalized language of mechanics. But that was the formal language of the Begriff shift was only, so to say, in Frege's eyes, was applicable to highly formalized sciences. Frege considered phenomena such as indexical sensitivity or presuppositions and so on as belonging to pragmatics, therefore not to logic. They were inaccessible to a precise logical representation. Montague, as we know, disagrees and shows the way. So Kaplan's demonstratives from a brilliant essay, demonstratives from 1989, can be seen as a conquest. Kaplan conquered the realm of indexical language and indexical thought to, so to say, to the Fregean kingdom of formal representation. Montague thought that basically the same strategy could be employed to represent adverbs and other notoriously difficult expressions in formal language. So nowadays, people like Hans Kamp, Irene Heim, and others, many people in linguistics are conquering, so to say, the field of conversational dynamics, are bringing them to the same kingdom, to the Fregean kingdom. Although Frege's name does not come up very frequently in this literature, in many papers in the field, his ideas are certainly the bedrock of this whole program, right? That's a second example. My third example is the so-called two-dimensional semantics, which is also an ongoing program, at least was, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, was an ongoing program championed by David Chalmers, Frank Jackson, and Robert Stalnaker, right? Chalmers is explicit in saying that his philosophical project is an attempt to restore the Fregean notion of senses as the cognitive significance of expressions in view of Kripke's challenge, in view of Kripke's discovery of necessary a posteriori truths and contingent a priori truths, right? This seems to be a challenge, it seems to be a crack in the Fregean building, and Chalmers is explicitly trying to restore the Fregean building, restoring the notion of sense. So this is in spirit, a very much Fregean program. Stalnaker is less explicit than Chalmers, but anyway, he says that his strategy, his analysis of assertions and diagonal propositions and so on are a strategy to restore the basic Fregean picture of belief as a relation between, as a binary relation between a subject and only one single entity, but this time not a proposition anymore, but a proposition, as Stalnaker calls it, a propositional concept. So it's basically a Fregean project as I see it. My fourth example comes from who I take to be Frege's most prominent disciple, which was Carnap, I think, because Carnap incarnates, as I said, the spirit of Frege's philosophy on the one hand, and his intellectual honesty and open-mindedness on the other hand, right? So the Carnapian notion of intention as a function from possible worlds into extensions, that's an attempt on Carnap's part in Meaning and Necessity from 1942, which Peter mentions in his paper, is an attempt to give a technical articulation to Frege's notion of sense. So even though some people nowadays, or a lot of people nowadays, they resist to use Frege's notion of sense, or they don't understand exactly what Frege meant by sense, even these people, they are not reluctant, they do not refuse to use the model of Carnapian intention as a function from possible worlds to appropriate extensions as a technical tool. So even anti-Fregean philosophers use Carnap's notion of intention, which is at the bottom a Fregean idea, a technical formulation of a Fregean idea, right? And this is a part of our everyday work as philosophers of language, using Carnap's notion of intention. So this is a fourth example, I would say, of Frege's enduring, even if sometimes unconscious, influence in contemporary analytic philosophy. So basically, every field of contemporary analytic philosophy uses this idea of the Carnapian idea of intention, even though they are not Fregean. Here's a fifth field, a fifth, so to say, research program, the speech act theory, which is, as far as I know, still an ongoing and very lively program. As Peter mentioned, the speech, what we call nowadays speech act theory, started with Austin, although there are some ancestors like Heinach, he mentioned also Heinach, but Austin, what we call the speech act theory, the way that we know it started with Austin in 1962, how to do things with words, and then later was championed by John Searle and Daniel van der Wecken, followed by many others, and it was practically overtaken by the linguists nowadays. This theory owes its basic insights to Frege. As Simons reminds us, Austin was the translation of Frege's Grundlagen to English, and almost certainly, Austin took the idea of illocutionary force to be a generalized version of what Frege calls Behauptungskraft, right? Frege uses this expression sometimes, the Kraft, right? Most likely, Austin took the notion or the idea of illocutionary force as a generalization of the idea of Behauptungskraft. Frege points out, I think Frege was the father of speech act theory, right? Frege points out on some occasions that we can separate the propositional content of an assertion from the act of asserting, properly speaking, right? We can separate them. But, and this is something interesting, he introduces some illocutionary force indicators in the formal language of logic and mathematics. They are not part of the meta language. They are not part of the pragmatics of German or the pragmatics of Italian. They are part of the formal language of logic and arithmetic. He introduces the assertion sign, which is the first symbol. This is the first logical symbol in Begriffsschrift and also in Grundgesetze. And later in section 24, he introduces the second symbol. Nowadays, we would call them illocutionary force indicators. And the first, when Frege introduces this symbol in section 24 of Grundgesetze, he says, what we do when we make a definition, when we produce a definition, is something different from an assertion. So we need a different symbol here to mark what we are doing when we are defining something. And that's when he introduces this here. That's what John Searle and Daniel van der Wecken, in their terminology, that's what they would call a declarative speech act. A declarative speech act is not an assertion, right? It's not an assertion. A declarative speech act is turning something into a truth, making something true by means of a speech act, right? By means of a performative verb. Normally there's a performative verb there. And Frege was, as I see it, the first to recognize that. These are the only, so to say, the only illocutionary force indicators that Frege explicitly recognized in his formal system, but there are others, right? This is the symbol. This is the symbol that he uses to mark an inference in the Grundgesetze, and he explains that as we are allowed to, or we should. This is what we would nowadays call a directive speech act. Is an equivalent to an order or a permission, and he uses this symbol as part of the formalism to indicate that, right? And there are others. Probably the use of Latin variables has to be seen as a special kind of illocutionary force indicator in the formal system of Grundgesetze. If I am allowed to do some propaganda here, there is an interesting paper that was just published in Synthese by me and two of my colleagues, bringing up illocutionary force indicators in the language of logic and mathematics, basically going back to the Fregean project of inserting illocutionary force indicators in the formal language, right? Not, I insist, this is not part of the meta language, this is not part of German, this is part of the formal language of logic. He was the first to recognize that. And this frequently goes unnoticed by Frege's commentators, both philosophers of mathematics and also philosophers of language. But here's an interesting passage by Daniel van der Wecken, where he points that out. He says, this is a treatise, Daniel van der Wecken wrote a treatise on speech act theory, and he says, modern logicians and philosophers of language did not recognize fully the philosophical importance of Frege's idea of admitting illocutionary force markers in the ideal object language of logic. Rapidly, Frege's assertion sign was eliminated from the object language of logic and became a meta-linguistic sign used only to identify the sentences of object language which are provable in axiomatic systems, right? So Daniel van der Wecken noticed that Frege uses that, introduces those symbols as part of the formal language. So, and okay, so these are my examples of 5 ongoing big, so to say, research programs that are basically they are DNA to some Fregean ideas. So I'm sure that Peter is going to agree with me. This is only a matter of emphasis. I would emphasize more Frege's influence in contemporary analytic philosophy in a broader realm than that Peter calls attention for. Because of course we know that the two-dimensional semantics is fundamental not just for the philosophy of language, but also for the philosophy of mind. Speech act theory, which has basically the Fregean DNA, is fundamentally important nowadays, not only for the philosophy of language, but also for political philosophy, even for ethics and so on, fields that Frege never dreamed of giving a contribution. But I think that his influence is much more widespread. So, since this is a debate, let me list some specific points of agreement with Peter, emphatic agreement with Peter, and some specific points of a slight disagreement, right? First, Peter, who was kind enough to send me a copy of his paper beforehand, sometimes he makes this assertion: to make Frege the sole star term in the inception of analytic philosophy is to oversimplify the story. That's very good, right? I'm totally in agreement. It's very good that Simons helps us to get a better picture. No great philosopher creates everything alone. In particular, it's good that he shows an anticipation of many things in Bolzano, right? So a history of philosophy, less worried about the mythology of great philosophers and more worried about the development of great ideas and methodology might benefit a lot from a careful examination of Bolzano. That's probably, Peter is probably helping to write the next chapter in the history of analytic philosophy. Maybe we are going to come to a Bolzano era, right? So here's a second remark that Peter makes. He talks about an unstated motivation in Übersinn und Bedeutung. This I see as totally correct, right? The order, he says, there's a stated and unstated motivation in Übersinn und Bedeutung. The order of exposition, right, in Übersinn und Bedeutung, that's the essay where Frege introduces the famous distinction between sense and reference, is misleading. Frege starts talking about identities, and he introduces the distinction between sense and reference first for proper names, and then generalize that for sentences, right, for complete sentences. I think the historic order is the opposite. If you read the preface of Grundgesetze, which was published only 1 year later, right? Frege says, well, I experimented with the idea that sentences have, as their reference, truth values. And the result was so much better, so much more elegant, that I had to revise an entire first version of my book. So it's very unlikely that Frege would have done that between 1892 and 1893. So what probably happened, and I think Peter is right on that, is that Frege experimented with 2 versions of his logicism. In one of those versions, right, we have, so to say, a normal in quotation marks semantics, and in another version, he introduced the idea that sentences are names of truth values, and there are only 2 of them, the true and the false, right? And that's incorporated in his formal system as Basic Law 4. Basic Law 4 says that every true sentences are identical and all false sentences are identical. That yields a much more elegant and much more interesting system, fruitful system, but that raises the immediate objection that how come that all true sentences say exactly the same, right? That's an objection. So that's why Frege thought that he has to introduce a second dimension of meaning or a second semantic dimension for sentences, and that's the dimension of thought or sense. And only later he extended that to proper names. So I think that's the unstated motivation for Übersinn und Bedeutung. Übersinn und Bedeutung was written after Frege had a ready version of Grundgesetze, which is where he introduces the notion of sentences as names of truth values, right? So I think Simons is very correct on that remark. Here, another marginal remark. He's talking about Frege on Wittgenstein. And he says, I'm completely at one with Frege in his dismay at Wittgenstein's intense reluctance to argue for his views, but rather to pronounce them like a prophet or an oracle. So I'm completely at one with Simons here, right? And he also says, he makes a remark about the translation of Bedeutung as meaning. And he says, together with Dietz, about long and wide, together with Dietz, they took the regrettable decision to translate Frege's Bedeutung as meaning, which, while linguistically correct, is philosophically horrendously misleading. I agree completely as well, right? I think the German term Bedeutung, as I see it, the German term Bedeutung is completely ambiguous between a semantic sense, which is reference. That's reference. That's the thing referred to in the world. In another sense, which is importance, right? But these 2 senses, these 2 meanings of Bedeutung are largely independent from one another. It's unfortunate that Frege himself helps to make the confusion, because in Übersinn und Bedeutung, he plays with both senses of Bedeutung, right? When he argues for the thesis that the Bedeutung of complete sentences are to be the truth values, he uses he switches from the semantic sense to the semantic connotation of Bedeutung to the importance connotation of Bedeutung. He goes back and forth. So he contributes a lot to mix these two senses. But the term is ambiguous. And we, in the 21st century, we as philosophers of language, we can separate both meanings of Bedeutung. And reference is probably the most accurate one when we are doing semantics, right? When we are doing philosophy of science, that's different. Maybe Bedeutung as importance is something relevant. But when we are doing semantics, Bedeutung as reference is what we want. So I'm totally with Simons here. Here are some minor points of disagreement. It's only emphasis or so in contrasting Frege's work in logic and foundation of mathematics, Simon says the following. On the other hand, Frege's writings in the philosophy of language and logic are modest in extent. I think that we can hardly think so, because Frege inspires the contemporary formal syntax. He inspires the formal semantics, contemporary formal semantics, and even pragmatics, right? Speech as theory is fundamentally of Fregean inspiration, as we saw, and even presupposition theory, right, comes from Frege's few mentionings of Voraussetzung in his writings, right? But they all have Frege as a starting point. That's less so in the theory of implicature, Rice's theory of implicature. So maybe we could say that Frege, it would be fair to say that Frege is the father of contemporary linguistics. I don't know. I will leave this question for Peter. But I think that his interests in the philosophy of language are not modest, because look at the widespread influence and the widespread he touched basically all important fields of philosophy of language, at least as we see it nowadays. I'm sure that this is only a matter of emphasis or only a matter of a few words, but let's see what Peter has to say about that. Here's the second minor point of disagreement. Twice you say in your paper that Dummett rightly praises Grundlagen der Arithmetik as the single most important work in the philosophy of mathematics. That strikes me a little bit unfair to Dedekind's equally incredible Was sind und was sollen die Zahlen, right? I think it owes nothing to Frege in terms of elegance and as a philosophical project, as well as Cantor's Beiträge, right? I would say Dummett is being unfair to both philosophers, right? Was sind und was sollen and Cantor's Beiträge are at least as brilliant, as rich in insight as Frege's Grundlagen der Arithmetik. Here is a third point of minor disagreement. Peter said, maybe as a provocation, I don't know. First, let us put to rest once and for all the idea that Frege was a philosopher. Maybe this was to provoke his Fregean audiences in the many conferences that he goes. He was a philosopher with an education, primary education and professional activity, primarily in mathematics, but this should not be seen as destroying his credentials as philosopher any more than, say, Freud's first training as a medical doctor destroys his credential as a psychoanalyst, right? This is also a counter provocation, Peter. So you can say something about that. Fourth, minor point of, is not a disagreement, but it's just a matter of emphasis. He says, it was Crispin Wright in his 1983 book, Frege's Conception of Numbers, which is a brilliant book. A whole generation of Fregean enthusiastic philosophers was really thrilled by this book, who inaugurated a new wave of examining Frege's philosophy of mathematics. I would locate the starting point of this neo-Fregean tradition slightly earlier in Charles Parsons' essay, Frege's Theory of Numbers from 1965. Maybe Crispin's book had a greater influence in British philosophy or in British Fregean philosophy, but I think Parsons was, so to say, the origin of these ideas, right? Parsons is the one who detects that Frege, after all, he proved Peano's postulates within the formal system of Grundgesetze, and he gives a hint of how to prove that in the already in the Grundlagen of arithmetic. So it's just a matter of emphasis. It's not really something crucial here. Well, the big message, the final message, the final sentence, the final word of Peter's paper was: is Frege still worth studying and teaching in the original text and their translations? Absolutely. Is it wrong to criticize Frege on any of his views? Certainly not. He's a giant on whose shoulders all analytic philosophers stood, but by emulating his honesty, precision, and clarity, we should be able to see further and more clearly. I couldn't agree more. And I would say, I think the contemporary neo-Russellian, people like Kaplan, Perry, Kripke, they couldn't agree more either, right? We just saw Perry is one of the champions of neo-Russellian philosophy. Just last year, he issued a book on Frege, right? He's going back to Frege, to Begriffsschrift, trying to understand some insights from the Begriffsschrift. I think that even the neo-Russellian, or so to say, the anti-Fregean team in analytic philosophy nowadays, they are nourished by Frege's ideas all the time. So they cultivate this critical dialogue with Frege, and I think that's the right attitude to have towards Frege. I always tell my students, the greatest lesson that you can learn from a great philosopher is not to believe this great philosopher. So that's how I think we should take Frege. Yeah. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Do I get a chance to reply to one or two of these points?
We have about 20 minutes, so you do whatever you want. If you want to reply, if you want to.
Okay. Well, first off, thank you, Marco. That was very helpful, actually. Like everyone who writes about this, I slightly exaggerate sometimes. So there were some useful corrections there. Firstly, thank you for bringing more names to people's attention of analytic philosophers who were and have been influenced by Frege, particularly Kaplan, Montague, Chalmers, Stalnaker, Parsons, and so on. You're quite right, of course, that in many directions, many what you call research programs in contemporary analytic philosophy, especially philosophy of language, but also philosophy of mind, philosophy of logic, Frege is present not necessarily in the focus of what people are saying, but his methodological attitudes and tools are there in what people do. So, for instance, situation semantics, which is in many ways as un-Fregean as possible, is still very much informed by the Fregean way of doing things. So I don't disagree with that at all. I'm slightly chastened to realize that I am going from a somewhat Anglo-centric point of view and forgetting what goes on in the east and west coast of the United States and in Australia and other parts of the English-speaking world. So I take that to heart. There aren't really any serious disagreements. There are as you say, there are points of emphasis. One or two positives I would take from that. One thing is, I agree that Frege's notation is actually rather beautiful and elegant. It's just not easy to typeset. But as Frege said, the requirements of the typesetter are not the primary thing that should concern us. That was easy for him to say because he was talking to a typesetter who made lead pieces down the road from where he lived. So he was also paying for it, which was a bit annoying for him. Incidentally, if you do just propositional logic, Frege's network of lines and strokes it is effectively a bracketless notation. And you can, in fact, turn any complex of lines and strokes, even if they have propositional letters embedded not on the right-hand side, down the side where usually all the things are listed. You can actually, without too much difficulty, turn the whole thing into a single complex connective in which you have the connective first and then a long list of arguments in order after that. That's an interesting little technical trick that you can play with Frege. So, I mean, the reason he doesn't need brackets is that the things that he has are themselves brackets, like the tree notation of modern semantics, and sorry, of modern syntax. Wir können alle zusammenarbeiten. This is the quote from Carnap. I think Carnap's view has turned out to be a little more optimistic than one might have hoped. Carnap was an optimist. I mean, he was an optimist during the days of the Vienna Circle. He was an optimist in California. And history has not proved Carnap correct on the optimism. And I think the reason is not because of the any bad ideas that Carnap has. I think what works against Carnap is the academic industry, the academic business. To get yourself appointed, and in particular to get yourself tenure and possibly a chair, basically you have to stick out from the crowd. You have to do something so distinctive that you will get tenure or get the appointment or get the publications ahead of your competitors. So I think that the academic appointments industry doesn't work in favor of Carnap's rather nice idea of sort of liberal socialist togetherness. Carnap, of course, was speaking from the position of a well-established tenured professor. But if you were talking to an anxious 26-year-old recent PhD student, they might be a little less sanguine about cooperation. And the negative effects are that
was a more relaxed time where people didn't have to worry about career.
It was also more relaxed. And the negative effects can be seen, especially in my discipline, metaphysics, where there are a whole range of extremely wacky positions held by people who are full professors of philosophy, positions which would have got you locked up in the 1930s, I think. Anyway, that's just a side comment. In terms of Frege's inventions, first of all, you're quite right to emphasize that Frege had this neo-Carnapian background. He'd studied with Lotze, he read Trendelenburg. I have an offprint of that famous Trendelenburg essay on Leibniz, which has the first occurrence of the word Begriffsschrift in it. I picked it up for 10 marks in a German bookshop. I hope it's worth a lot more now.
Or Wahrheitswert? You mean Wahrheitswert?
No, I mean Begriffsschrift.
Oh, because Gottfried Gabriel says that Trendelenburg is the inventor of the term Wahrheitswert. The term comes from Trendelenburg.
That may be true as well, but the word Begriffsschrift comes from Trendelenburg's essay on Leibniz, which Frege quotes at the beginning of Begriffsschrift. Now, in terms of Frege's actual innovations, what would the possible world look like if we deleted Frege from it? And I think the answer is it wouldn't look hugely different for the following reason. Quite a few of those innovations were already being undertaken, if not marketed in the same way, especially by Peirce and his students who independently invented quantification. Peirce also was very active in the philosophy of relations, and that passed on to Schroeder and via Schroeder on to others such as Tarski. I think Russell would have got quite a few things right. On truth values, I think you can still hold that the semantic values of sentences are truth values, the extensions of sentences are truth values, without saying that sentences are names. And I think Wittgenstein and Russell were working in that direction. Let's see. Oh, I also think that Frege would shake his head in disbelief at some aspects of Montague and Stalmacher semantics, namely the abundance of possible worlds which serve as the vehicle for a lot of analyses. And personally, I would be on Frege's and Russell's side on that one. I'm a bit of a skeptic about modality, but
I think the California team are showing that Frege was wrong about that. Right?
Well, you can model a lot using possible worlds. I'll give you that. But anyway, I'm not an expert in formal semantics, so I'll just tell you where my gut feelings lie on that. I also think that you can do a theory of belief much more along Russell's lines than anyone, including Russell, thought was possible. I think you can largely, if not completely, rescue the multiple relation theory of belief from the dustbin of history. That's another thing. Perhaps one thing that Frege did stress, well, not so much stress as put into practice, which has proved of inestimable value for subsequent philosophy of logic and language, is the compositionality principle, that the intentions and extensions of complex expressions are functions of the intentions and extensions of their parts. And I do think that that is despite the fact that there are one or two people like Hintiker who have disagreed with that, I think that's an advance that we will never need to undo. On being unfair to Dedekind and Cantor, of course, they were the great contemporaries of Frege in that area. I also mentioned Hilbert, of course. I agree about Dedekind. Dedekind was the other logicist alongside Frege, and in some ways he got things more correct than Frege because he didn't fall into inconsistency. He did have a little tweak of psychologism, or of what we might call optimism, in the idea that we can bring objects into existence by doing things. This is what Russell meant by the advantage of theft over honest toil. You postulate bringing the irrationals into existence because you've got lots of irrationals as well. But Dedekind was certainly in many ways more of a philosopher than Cantor. Cantor's brilliance lies in his invention of set theory and transfinite arithmetic, ordinal and cardinal. And Dedekind, well, I mean, both of Dedekind's major essays constitute the sort of thing that Frege was doing, which was putting long-established theories on a sound footing, whereas Cantor was inventing something absolutely brilliant and new, with the influence of Bolzano, I might add, who was the first person to use the word Menge in much the modern sense. Speech act theory, I agree, that is interesting. The assertion and definitional sign noted. They do have different force because the one states, but basically this is a theorem, and I, Gottlob Frege, hold this to be a name of the true. The other says, this is how I'm going to use this expression, so look out. I hadn't thought about the inference line, but that's an interesting one. One of the villains in this piece was Wittgenstein, who says of the assertion sign in Russell, but also in Frege, that it merely serves to indicate that the authors hold that to be a theorem. And therefore he basically threw it out. Whereas I think it is interesting to see what use can be made of the different illocutionary forces that they exert. I'll think about that. The idea that you can divorce the assertion from the content of the assertion is what Peter Geach calls the Frege point. He regards it, as if you like, as the very basic point that Frege gets started on. Anything else? I think that's probably all that I have to say. As I say, I don't welcome everything that's gone on under some of the research programs that Marco emphasized, the later research programs, in particular the extravagant use of possible worlds and other fictions to offer semantic analyses. But if you're, sorry, if you're just doing models and not explaining how things go on in people's heads, then I think that's reasonable. So I think I'll leave it there. I don't know if you've got any comments on my comments.
To say something about my provocation, so it would be more rightfully to say that Frege is the father of contemporary linguistics than analytic philosophy. That's a provocation, of course not, but what do you think?
Well, there are other fathers as well. I mean, I'm thinking of people that, well, think of Bloomfield, for example, in the 30s, or Jespersen in the 20s, or Zelig Harris, who was teacher of Noam Chomsky. Those all were very important in linguistics. I think what's happened is that a lot of linguists have helped themselves, I think very profitably, to a lot of the ideas of Frege, prompted no doubt by people like Carnap and Montague in particular. Montague is interesting because Montague in a way is somebody who turns away from Tarski's existentialism towards something much closer to Frege. And much as I think his way of doing things is not how I would do things, especially in regard to indexicals, nevertheless, what it shows is that Frege was most influential on what you might call West Coast semantics. And that's due to lots of people. It's partly Carnap, it's partly Montague and so on. But Tarski, although he had lots and lots of influence on West Coast semantics, is really in the minority, and that he confines himself for Varsovian reasons to extensions and doesn't get involved in all this messy intentional stuff. But yeah, I think Frege's influence is there in semantics. I would also mention other people who were involved. For instance, the analysis of action statements by Davidson has gone over into semantics as more or less the normal way of giving an analysis of propositions about actions and events and processes, partly helped by people like Parsons, Terry Parsons, not Chuck Parsons. So there is an awful lot of Fregean influence there. So I'm not going to disagree when you say that the Fregean DNA is in all of us. I mean, even such of those of us who go in different directions, for example, in the theory of sets or in the theory of intentions, we still do things in, broadly speaking, a Fregean manner. Otherwise, we're not doing them properly. I'm finished, I think. I think that's about all I have to say. I will take account of those when writing things up. Good. I won't steal your points, but I will perhaps modify my. Sorry.
So you seem, just one final remark, you seem to be a little reluctant when I said that there is a widespread acceptance of the Carnapian notion of intention as a function from, as a working tool for philosophers of language and metaphysics. You seem a little reluctant. Am I right?
Well, I'm not reluctant on point of view of the sociology of linguistics and philosophy of language. I think you're probably right that is the majority way of working. My reluctance stems from my disapproval of possible and therefore a wish to do things in a different way. For instance, when I was talking about sense, I talked about different compositional routes to the reference. I mean, some of this is in Pavel Tichy's very idiosyncratic commentary on Frege, but I do think there are different ways to approach sense than simply as functions from extravagant to huge sets of possible worlds to other more mundane things. I think it has to be in a way which makes sense of the way we think rather than the way we can model things using mathematical extravagances.
Okay. Good. Peter, if I understand, there is no possibility that the public can ask questions to you. So I'm in charge of closing this section, and let me warmly thank you for this great presentation, a very interesting paper, both from a historic point of view and sociological point of view of the sociology of analytic philosophy, and pointing out to the future. So analytic philosophers, go and read Bolzano. That's the future, right?
Yes, yes, very good. You can do it in English now. Let me just say one more thing. Because there isn't the possibility of discussion, may I invite anyone who has a point or a question to get in touch with me by email. I'm more than happy to send them the text of my talk, and we can carry on from there. I must say it is so wonderful to be back doing philosophy during the summer, partly because of the summer break and partly because of lockdown restrictions and the usual worries about COVID. I was sort of hanging from the ceiling at various points, wondering how sane I was. Whereas now, not only am I going to several conferences, but virtually, but also teaching as well. So I'm beginning to feel like a philosopher instead of just someone who mows the lawn and makes dinner.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Peter. It was great to see you.
I will not be able to come tomorrow because I am teaching in Switzerland, but on Thursday, I know Guillaume is speaking, and I was in conversation with him last week over Ingarden, so it'll be nice to see Guillaume again. So apologies for not being there tomorrow, but Thursday I'll be back.
All right. So
okay.
We are closing this.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thanks a lot. Bye, Mario. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.